Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th hour. In this week's news for the week of December 13th to 19th, 2020, a snowstorm covers New York City ravaged by a pandemic. De Blasio and Cuomo ordered the closing of indoor dining, while the governor was hit with a sexual harassment complaint. Trump is seriously considering pleas for martial law from his supporters. Biden finally begins decrying attempts at overturning the election, and Congress is on the cusp of approving new COVID relief while staving off a government shutdown. Now, on to the show. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Beginning with de Blasio. A shooting occurred this week in front of St. John's Cathedral after a Christmas Carol performance in Manhattan. Fortunately, there were no deaths aside from the shooter who was gunned down by the NYPD. It seems the shooter was seeking suicide by cop as he was shooting into the air. City hospitals have started the process of inoculating frontline healthcare workers from the COVID virus, with Queens becoming one of the first places to give someone a shot, as we detail later. Mount Sinai briefly got in trouble for giving a marketing employee a shot before healthcare workers. The city's public hospital system suspended elective surgeries to free up space for COVID patients as rates go up, as reporting revealed New York City Health and Hospitals didn't follow up on its own plan on how to deal with a viral airborne disease. De Blasio said it will take until June of next year to get everyone vaccinated. The governor announced with de Blasio's support that indoor dining was to be shut down with strict regulations concerning outdoor dining in the midst of a cold winter and a strong storm that brought a lot of snow into the state. Restaurant owners were up in arms after the announcement, saying the restrictions would kill off their businesses without government support, and just before a winter storm had come in later this week which would hobble outdoor dining. Matters were made worse after the city announced rules that forbid people from entering restaurants altogether, including using the bathroom. The regulations were walked back after council members got involved, channeling the outrage of their constituents. The mayor is still warning that the city might need to shut down as numbers keep rising. Micro-businesses with less than 10 employees took advantage of the federal Paycheck Protection Program, but with the expiration of the CARES Act, those loans are drying out. New Yorkers might be familiar with sheriffs as being the primary police force in small towns, but the city's own sheriffs have been out in full force enforcing COVID measures such as banning parties and enforcing checkpoints, being profiled in the New York Times this week. The publication The City also profiled the many public fridges that have been popping up in various parts of the city, with increased efforts to keep them stocked, including enlisting the help of food pantries in response to the pandemic. One of the more famous fridges is located in Rockaway Beach, with particular attention paid to making sure it doesn't get ransacked by troublemakers. The city's middle and high schools continue to be closed as elementary students are attending school in person if they haven't chosen remote learning, with all schools having been temporarily closed this Thursday due to the snowstorm. De Blasio said that more District 75 schools which serve special education students will open in person beginning in January. The mayor also announced changes to how the city's selective schools admit students in an attempt to address racial disparities, with middle schools eliminating admission screenings for a year using a random lottery instead, copying a successful experiment spearheaded by a school in Brooklyn. The mayor also eliminated a policy that gave zoned students a first spot in line at some high schools. The teachers' unions are still calling for tighter restrictions to combat the rising COVID numbers in the city. Students in jails are still unable to video conference, a massive disadvantage for pupils in the jail system. A few weeks ago, we reported how the city designated a nonprofit agency that is owned by the city to pay a $890 million school bus contract that essentially bailed out that nonprofit from running out of money. This week, the City Panel for Education Policy green-lighted that contract, not likely stopping those who are curious about the politics of the contract. Meanwhile, remote learning has killed chances for a snow day after the snowstorm this week, with the mayor making it clear that the different learning environment eliminates the earlier need to keep kids from school since they can learn from home. The MTA has constantly said that it needs more money to operate, but it hasn't felt more urgent than now, especially with the pandemic. Even with Congress providing $4 billion, it won't be enough to plug a $12 billion hole for the Transportation Authority, which could lead to layoffs and service disruptions. A vote by the MTA board to institute those cuts were held off this week, but the board did move forward with cuts to the LIRR service, as well as 4% fare and toll increases that were planned before the pandemic. Even though cuts weren't put in place, the MTA may not have a choice as the workforce has seen a triple-sized increase in COVID-infected employees. One small ounce of success came in the news this week regarding homeless people in the subway, with the Gothamist reporting that an outreach program has triumphantly diverted homeless people into housing rather than sending them to shelters. Brooklyn's Gowanus Canal is finally receiving some sort of cleanup, costing $1.5 billion, and giving residents a first-hand view of what it is that's really floating in the water. The city is also greenlighting plans to change the commercial waste industry, which supporters say are causing deaths due to reckless garbage truck drivers who weren't regulated. The changes include switching to a zone-based system and cutting truck traffic in half instead of allowing a free-for-all by garbage companies. Public advocate Jumaane Williams released his list of the worst landlords of 2020, with notorious landlord Jason Korn topping the list and receiving 1,822 violations across his 10 buildings this year alone. Korn was joined by the New York City Housing Authority in charge of the many public housing projects throughout the city. The New York Times profiled NYCHA residents that described not being able to escape their dismal apartments in the midst of the pandemic. Big names continue to line up on whether they're going to run for mayor next year. Andrew Yang, the former presidential candidate that ran on universal basic income, a policy that would pay people money on top of their daily lives, is gearing up for a run. Ross Barkan profiled Yang's mayoral prospects, saying that the potential candidate is a blank slate, considering he hasn't released any positions on city issues. Former Representative Max Rose, who recently lost his re-election to Nicole Malliotakis, has opened a campaign account and said that he is exploring a run for mayor. Politico reported that angel investor Lisa Blau is figuring out a way to get more city residents to the polls in time for the June mayoral primary. Councilwoman Vanessa Gibson is gearing up for a run for Bronx Borough President, saying that the borough needs more job opportunities in order to get back on its feet. After a court order forcing them to hold a virtual meeting, the Brooklyn Democratic Party held a Zoom meeting over 13 hours, which largely devolved into chaos as leaders miscounted votes and members called for more transparency. Meanwhile, in the Manhattan DA race, Janos Martin dropped out due to having what he called a massive disadvantage in campaign fundraising. Martin was a progressive candidate that pledged to use his experience as a civil rights attorney and his work with the ACLU. The city's campaign finance board approved $17.3 million in public matching funds for 61 candidates running for office in the next year. The city matches private donations 8-1 to reduce the amount of private contributions influencing politicians. The city's museums, theaters, and cultural nonprofits will be getting aid soon as the City Department of Cultural Affairs announced a $47.1 million grant going to 1,000 groups. Police Commissioner Dermot Shea said that there's a slim chance vaccinations will be mandatory for cops, after saying earlier that police wouldn't be required to get a shot. The Civilian Complaint Review Board concluded that the NYPD mishandled the way it responded to the BLM protests earlier in the year, with poorly trained officers handling protest tactics, as well as utilizing controversial strategies such as kettling, which heightened tensions. The NYPD are beginning to focus on gang leaders in a new effort to stop the city's gun violence rate. Despite city authorities promising to cut back on the scope of a DNA program that collected the DNA profiles of city residents taken without their consent nor having been convicted of crimes, only 938 profiles were removed from the 8,000-strong database. Separately, the city is seeing its deadliest year in traffic and pedestrian fatalities since de Blasio took office, a failure of his Vision Zero plan that aimed to stop those deaths in their tracks. Moving on to the city council. As ranked choice voting continues to be assailed by politicians who are worried that the new electoral system will sideline minorities, a group of more than 20 female city council candidates sent an open letter to the council to resist delaying the new system. Ranked choice voting allows voters to select their candidates by preference as opposed to a winner-take-all system. The top two candidates then go on to a runoff if someone doesn't have more than 50%. 13 candidates filed petitions right before a deadline this week in order to replace Councilman Donovan Richards, who was just installed as the new Queensborough president. The election to replace Donovan Richards is in February. Council Speaker Corey Johnson released a report this week on the council's land use process, the procedure by which the city government decides how city land is zoned and otherwise utilized by developers and businesses. The report slammed the land use process, calling it a fragmented mess that needs absolute and total reform. City council staff have successfully unionized their first group of workers, with the group becoming one of the first legislative staff unions in the state. Council staff have long called to unionize, saying they are not protected as they work for council members from labor abuses and harassment. The council also passed a couple of bills aimed to increase school transparency regarding attendance and remote learning metrics after the pandemic highlighted the mess of remote learning planned by the Department of Education. Councilman Stephen Levin, representing parts of Brooklyn, and Councilwoman Helen Rosenthal, representing the Upper West Side of Manhattan, had introduced a bill this week that would have banned the NYPD from conducting outreach to the homeless. The measure was strongly opposed by the NYPD and Mayor de Blasio, saying a complete ban is inappropriate. Supporters of the bill say that cops arrest homeless individuals more than actually help them, hoping to reduce negative encounters. Two bills in the council that want to make stronger regulations relating to how fast food restaurants can fire employees has pissed off the restaurant industry even more in a time when their businesses are closing due to the pandemic. Councilman Brad Lander, one of the sponsors, said that fast food workers shouldn't be considered at will at a time when they can't support their families, and the bills passed on the council floor this Thursday, forbidding restaurants from firing employees without just cause. Outgoing Bronx councilman and newly elected Congressmember Richie Torres has been on the forefront decrying and asking why the NYPD still has Deputy Inspector James Coble on the payroll after it was discovered Coble posted racist remarks online. 5 public and private city unions are joining together to collectively release a slate of 26 endorsements in the upcoming council races next year. The unions collectively represent more than 360,000 workers, announcing a partnership called #LaborStrong2021 and include unions such as the Hotel Trades Council, the 32BJ SEIU, District Council 37, the New York State Nurses Association, and much more. Endorsements are rolling in from other groups such as the Democratic Socialists of America and the pro-development Open New York. Moving on to Cuomo. As New York State is receiving vaccine shipments, it is going after companies that haven't timely delivered virus supplies like ventilators and masks. State officials say that they are seeking a refund of a third of the $1.1 billion spent on supplies. Long Island Jewish Medical Center ICU nurse Sandra Lindsay was one of the first people in the state to get vaccinated, and Cuomo said that members of the general public with pre-existing health conditions would get the vaccine sometime in late January. The optimism that came with the vaccine rollout did not calm nurses in the state that say hospitals are still rife with poor safety protocols and low staffing levels that could endanger the lives of patients and hospital workers alike. The number of hospitalized New Yorkers with COVID hit almost 6,150 people, a number not seen since May, and is 6 times more people hospitalized than 2 months ago. Charities and nonprofits are also facing ruin since they needed to step up and help people in the pandemic, decrying the state for not offering more assistance. As the state legislature waits to get together and decide on issues such as raising taxes and extending an eviction moratorium, Cuomo extended a ban on commercial evictions and foreclosures until January 31st, 2021, released a new rent relief program to help struggling tenants 2 weeks before the federal funds designated to the program is set to expire, and rejected the idea that the state legislature should come together to raise taxes. Cuomo also said that his administration is greenlighting minimum wage increases in upstate towns and suburbs, despite small businesses being hurt by the pandemic. Governor Cuomo has been accused of sexual harassment by former aide and Manhattan Borough President candidate Lindsey Boylan, with Boylan saying Cuomo had been improperly commenting on her appearance for 3 years while she worked for him. After Boylan made the claim, she said she wasn't going to talk to journalists about the claims, while reporting revealed that she was let go herself from Cuomo's office for bullying behavior against other employees. New York Republicans wasted no time in calling for investigation, such as upstate Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. The Board of Regents said they want the $1.1 billion Cuomo cut from education funds and the money with any federal grants that come in, arguing that federal money was never meant to replace any money cut from the fund. The board also adopted the state's first K-12 computer science and digital fluency learning standards after planning for 2 years. The board also said that funding for schools should be held the same until the end of the 2021-22 school year, underscoring the severity of the pandemic on the budget when it called for a $2 billion increase last year. Reporting continues to highlight whether Cuomo shot himself in the foot by releasing a report throwing into question the need for a new underground train tunnel underneath the Hudson River called the Gateway Project. While Trump is in office, Cuomo implored Trump to fund the $13 billion project, but has since released a report concluding that fixing existing tunnels might just do the job in transporting commuters. Meanwhile, LIRR Capital Projects have run $70 million over budget and behind schedule, according to a report by the state comptroller Thomas DiNapoli. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey approved a 15% reduction in its spending for next year due to the pandemic's $3 billion loss to the agency, while also facing a record package haul for the holidays. Cuomo signed a few bills this week, including one that bans ICE from watching or arresting undocumented immigrants at state courthouses, and a ban on hate symbols like the Confederate flag and the swastika on state property, with First Amendment scholars throwing cold water on that bill's constitutionality. In Rochester, New York, the Office of Public Integrity there concluded that Mayor Lovely Warren and her administration did not violate any city or ethics policies in how they handled the death of Daniel Prude at the hands of Rochester police when cops put a spit bag over Prude's head when he was having a mental health episode coupled by adverse effects from drugs, holding him down in a way that asphyxiated him. The disgraced former police chief Leroy Singleton had accused Mayor Warren of telling him to lie in official testimony to investigators about the case. Residents in South Nyack decided to dissolve their village, officially ending the 142-year-old Rockland municipality in exchange for being taken in by municipal services from neighboring Orangetown. Moving on to Albany. Assembly Speaker Carl Hasty warned at the start of the week that the Assembly may have to come together in a special session in order to raise taxes as New York State continues to bleed financially, as well as pass an eviction moratorium. Democrats have pushed for more taxes on the wealthy in order to plug the budget hole in the state. The state Senate wants to pass an indefinite residential eviction moratorium, but the Assembly is unwilling to go that far. Other groups are lobbying for tax increases in areas other than targeting the wealthy, including anti-tobacco groups calling for increasing a tax on cigarette packs by $1. Progressive groups like the Center for Community Alternatives are pushing for new policies such as supporting legal marijuana, decriminalizing prostitution, and more in what they're calling a justice roadmap. Public defenders in the city are also releasing their own agenda, calling for legalizing marijuana, releasing old prisoners on parole, limiting solitary confinement. 5 new Democratic state senators are saying that their election victories are going to lay out new issues on the table at the start of the state legislative term. Senators Sean Ryan, Michelle Hinchey, and John Mannion are among the 5 bringing issues such as upstate rural economic policies, from reviving the upstate industrial scene to preventing tax increases. 2 Long Island state lawmakers, Rudy Sunderman and William Spencer, are refusing to resign their seats while they're facing felony criminal charges. Another recently elected Long Island politician, Nicholas Kurokapa, was arrested himself on domestic violence-related charges. Lawmakers can keep their seats while under investigation under New York law. Robert Orr was elected as Senate Minority Leader unanimously by the Republican caucus in the chamber. New York Republicans are looking to build the New York Republican Party back to some sort of prominence as the New York legislature enjoys a Democratic supermajority. Separately, Joe Griffo said that he was stepping aside as the Republican Deputy Minority Leader after stepping in to replace John Flanagan, who resigned his post in the face of Democratic electoral victories. Moving on to the state courts. A Brooklyn woman who was shoved to the ground by a police officer in May is suing New York City. Dunya Zaire was on video being pushed in one of the first videos showing police brutality as a response to the George Floyd protests in New York City. State Attorney General Letitia James filed for a court order against the Queens private jail following an investigation into the Queens detention facility and its conditions. The GEO Group, the private Queens jail company, allegedly ignored the AG's subpoenas related to the investigation, and James asked a Manhattan Supreme Court judge this week to sign an order compelling the release of those documents. While certain public officials have decried ranked choice voting, as we mentioned earlier, some opponents of the new system, approved by voters, took the issue to court, but Manhattan Supreme Court Judge Carol Edmeade denied a request from 6 council members and several community groups to place a temporary stop to the new voting system for an election in February to replace Councilman Rory Landsman following his departure to the Cuomo administration. The court said granting the request would disenfranchise military balloters. A civil rights attorney filed a lawsuit against Nassau County's lawmakers saying a labor agreement with the police force should be void because the agreement was passed on an emergency basis. Frederick Brewington, the lawyer, represents Doris Sharp, who said that the Nassau County legislature approved what it called a tentative deal that lasts 8.5 years. State Supreme Court Justice James McCormick issued an order delaying the implementation of the labor agreement as the court will conduct hearings as to why the legislature passed the agreement outside the normal legislative process. Moving on to Trump. We are still here weeks after the 2020 presidential election, but Trump is still refusing to concede defeat, interfering in Georgia, particularly at an unprecedented rate that has never been seen before in modern history. Even Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp, who was supported by Trump in his election, publicly refuses to do anything to help overturn the election for Trump. However, with Trump's continued lies and falsehoods concerning the election results, he has cemented his hold over the Republican Party like no other recent president has. There was another march this week in D.C. by Trump supporters, which included the likes of the Proud Boys, a self-proclaimed Western chauvinist group which resorts to political violence. The march was followed by a series of stabbings after the sun went down, with videos of Proud Boy members chasing after people and setting fire to Black Lives Matter flags. The president's hardcore supporters have called for martial law, including using the army to keep Trump in office, with Rudy Giuliani advocating for the Department of Homeland Security to seize voting machines in battleground states that did not go in Trump's favor. The jig was up for many holdouts in support of Trump's victory once the Electoral College voted on Monday, cementing Biden's win. Eyes will be on Vice President Pence as he will preside over the congressional session that formalizes the Electoral College results on January 6th, with reporting revealing that the vice president will be taking an overseas trip to Europe and the Middle East directly after acknowledging Biden's win. Trump continued to rage in different ways, including taking the extraordinary step of announcing the firing of his second Attorney General, Bill Barr, after Barr said there wasn't evidence of voter fraud. Many expected Barr's firing after he made that statement, as Trump publicly admonished him for saying it. Barr was largely seen as a sycophant to the president, interfering in legal matters that personally implicated Trump. Deputy Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen will step in as acting AG, with eyes on what Rosen will do about Trump's call for a special prosecutor to investigate Joe Biden's son Hunter. After reports revealed, the Department of Justice launched a probe looking at Hunter's taxes and business relationships, something Barr refused to publicly acknowledge as part of a DOJ practice to not release information so close to an election. NBC News also reported that Trump wanted to fire FBI Director Christopher Wray, but the White House counsel's office warned Trump against doing that, saying that firing Wray can place Trump in legal jeopardy. Trump will be in legal jeopardy no matter what after he leaves office, as reporting came out this week revealed Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner helped create a company that secretly paid the Trump family out of re-election money raised from supporters, with about $60 million being controlled by political action committees that Trump and his family control. Reporting continues to support the story that Trump is jumping back and forth about whether he will run again in 2024. While Trump is figuring that out, he is also set on living in his Florida resort, but residents at Mar-a-Lago don't want him there, pointing to an agreement Trump signed when the resort was being constructed that apparently says Trump agreed not to live there in exchange for the resort being built. One of Trump's favorite lies to spread involves the voting tech company Smartmatic, claiming the company rigged votes in favor of Biden. The claim was picked up by conservative pundits at Fox News, including Lou Dobbs, who was actually forced to fact-check his own statements this week after Smartmatic threatened to sue Fox. Trump's legacy has started getting analyzed, with the president's imprint on expanding the conservative judiciary to physically damaging landscapes in an effort to build a few miles of his border wall being reported. The president-elect continues to face pressure from all sides as he continues to build his cabinet, with establishmentarians and progressives fighting for their views to be represented in the White House. Never mind the Republican opposition to picks like Neera Tanden for Office of Management and Budget. Director, and Vivek Murthy for the Surgeon General. Some more big names Biden named for his cabinet were former presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg for Transportation Secretary, becoming the first openly gay cabinet member if he gets confirmed, Debbie Haaland for Interior Secretary, becoming the first indigenous woman in the cabinet if she gets confirmed, and Michael Reagan for EPA, becoming the first black man in that post. Gina McCarthy, the former head of the EPA, was chosen to lead Biden's climate team, while former Michigan governor and current pundit Jennifer Granholm was chosen to lead the Energy Department, which oversees America's electrical grid and nuclear stockpile. While Secretary of State Pompeo said that he planned on meeting Anthony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State pick, this week, Trump's Defense Department acting chief Chris Miller formally told his people not to engage with Biden's staff, further hampering transition efforts, particularly in areas of national security. Biden also continues to say that he won't employ a loose hand when it comes to executive orders to overturn Trump's actions while he was in office, but progressives wish for a bigger sense of urgency with doing so. Biden also separately came out this week to publicly condemn Trump's repeated interference in the 2020 presidential election after the Electoral College officially tallied his win, calling Trump's actions unconscionable. Regarding the inauguration on January 20th, Biden and Harris will take their oaths upon the same Capitol stage famously known to viewers, but everything else will be basically virtual. A massive hacking operation pulled off by the Russian government has sent shockwaves through the federal government, with reporting revealing that 6 federal agencies from the State Department to the Treasury were exposed, as well as major companies such as Microsoft. Members of the Russian intelligence apparatus gained entry to government email systems by way of private software updates called patches, and the extent of the cyber intrusion is still being ascertained, with government officials saying that the government should act as if Russia has full control of the afflicted networks. Secretary of State Pompeo publicly acknowledged Russia being behind the hacking attack, but President Trump came out to downplay the hacks on Saturday, saying the media is exaggerating the extent of the damage and even blamed China without any evidence. Experts are warning that the U.S. government, after years of investment to prevent such a hacking attack, was caught so blindsided over Russia's actions, and Trump has continued trends to refuse to blame Russia when it comes to certain state actions such as hacking operations. As the White House pushes a rushed vaccine rollout, Trump hasn't said if he'll get vaccinated in public like many of his predecessors said they would. Biden said he would get a public vaccine on Monday, while Pence received his vaccine publicly on Friday. As Pfizer was getting its vaccine distributed throughout the nation, Moderna got its vaccine officially approved for emergency authorization from the FDA this week, the difference between the vaccines being that Moderna's shots don't have to be refrigerated like Pfizer's, making it easier to reach rural inhabitants. Some states got accidental extra shipments of the vaccine, getting a sort of holiday gift as people are waiting to get vaccinated. This coming out while there has been reporting of confusion by states seeing reduced shipments, while Pfizer says there are millions of unclaimed doses. The FDA also granted emergency authorization to an at-home over-the-counter COVID test that cost $30 and would give results within minutes after a nasal swab without the need to send out specimens to a lab. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also briefly quarantined after the State Department announced his exposure, with no details on how he might have gotten infected. Pompeo has tested negative so far. The Labor Department's weekly unemployment report showed that jobless claims rose to 885,000, the highest since September, and an increase from 862,000 last week as cases continue to rise in the country and the economy continues to struggle. In 2007, former FBI agent Robert Levinson disappeared while on duty in the Middle East and presumed dead, with suspicions always pointing to Iran being the cause. The Trump administration concluded Iran was officially responsible for Levinson's death, formally imposing sanctions on 2 Iranian officials. Despite the ongoing lobbying of sanctions on Iran, the country's President Rouhani said that there's no doubt that Biden will rejoin the nuclear agreement spearheaded by President Obama to reduce Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for sanction relief, all the while Iran continues to build underground nuclear facilities. Separately, the DOJ is planning to unveil new charges against the possible suspect in the 1988 Lockerbie airline bombing, which saw the explosion of an airplane over Scotland, killing 270 people by Libyan terrorists. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, met with Taliban representatives this week to continue discussion of a possible peace deal, as Trump keeps pushing for a large troop withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan. Talks were stopped as details were hard to iron out and the Taliban increased its attack on civilians. The State Department announced that Sudan is no longer on the U.S. list of terror sponsors, which includes the likes of Iran. Removing Sudan from the list gives it a chance to receive U.S. grants and is likely tied to the country's recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. Meanwhile, the U.S. designated Switzerland and Vietnam as currency manipulators and added Thailand, Taiwan, and India to watch lists, saying the countries purposely handle their currencies in ways that artificially lower their value to gain an unfair advantage in international trade. People have called for China to be added to the list for a long time, but doing so would heighten trade confrontations to new highs and creates geopolitical issues. Government officials are also confused about whether to include subsidiaries on a list of Chinese companies investors aren't allowed to put money into, ever since Trump signed off on an executive order in November. The USPS says it's gridlocked as Americans are ordering more packages because they're staying home, causing a huge delay in holiday packages being delivered. Since FedEx and UPS are refusing to work with certain retailers, the overtime being put in by USPS workers also raises concerns as Georgia is set to have its runoff election in a few weeks, with mail-in ballots still being expected as a huge chunk of accepted votes. Moving on to Congress. Congress is at it for weeks negotiating not just a package for COVID relief, but to also fund itself, passing continuing resolutions that allow the government to stay open in the midst of talks. The 5 people holding the cards for millions of people are House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, discussing a myriad of issues including stimulus checks, unemployment extensions, state and local government aid, business liability shields against COVID lawsuits, and so much more. Most recently, both chambers passed the defense spending bill despite President Trump's veto threats, passed a 2-day continuing resolution to buy more time for a bigger government funding bill, and are still hammering down the details of a COVID relief bill that might see $600 stimulus checks, $300 a week unemployment assistance, but no state and local government aid or liability shields as of the time of this recording. There were snags on the Senate about increasing stimulus checks back to $1,200, spearheaded by Democrat Bernie Sanders and Republican Josh Hawley, but a major opposition to getting any deal even passed in the Senate comes from Wisconsin Republican Ron Johnson, who claims he doesn't want to add more to the nation's debt. Meanwhile, members of Congress are getting their own vaccination shots before most of the public gets the chance, with some saying they want to be an example for their constituents and show that there is nothing to fear from being inoculated. In the House, 2/3 of Republican House members and 18 state attorneys general signed onto a lawsuit which has since been dismissed, which was led by Texas to overturn the presidential election results in battleground states. These are Republicans unwilling to accept Biden as president-elect. The Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, which have been at the center of opioid lawsuits settling with states concerning its responsibility pushing drugs leading to record overdoses, appeared before the House Oversight Committee this week. The committee sought to get answers from the Sacklers about how they were largely shielded from taking responsibility for the opioid crisis themselves. While the Sacklers took large heat from the committee members, they refused to say they did anything wrong and insisted Purdue Pharma acted legally. The way Democrats plan on moving forward with their governing philosophy under Biden's leadership continues to be cemented, with the victory of New York Congresswoman Kathleen Rice over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to lead the Energy and Commerce Committee, a coveted spot for up-and-coming congressional leaders. Rice beat AOC 46-13 for the seat. The upstate New York congressional race between Anthony Brindisi and Claudia Tenney continues in the courts, with lawyers battling over a handful of absentee ballots. Over in the Senate, some Republicans in Congress are not so fast to support Trump in whatever he says about the election results. Lamar Alexander, Republican senator from Tennessee, said this week that Trump needs to accept the election results, putting the country first. Even Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was forced to congratulate Biden at the Electoral College vote, with critics saying the delay in acknowledging the results of the election has already caused incredible damage to America's democratic norms. Eyes are still on Georgia as the race heats up before the January 5th runoff between Perdue and Ossoff and Loeffler and Warnock. Biden and Harris stumped in the state this week, as well as VP Pence. A record number of new voters were signed up, and Democratic and Republican campaign groups are flushing the state with cash. In the judicial branch, SCOTUS swatted down a challenge led by Texas's State Attorney General Ken Paxton to overturn the presidential election results in 4 battleground states, saying that Texas did not have standing to sue other states for their own election practices. Justices Alito and Thomas wrote that they would have let Texas get past the filing stage, but wouldn't have granted Texas the relief they asked for, which was a do-over of the election. President Trump predictably didn't have the best reaction to the news, largely banking on the High Court to vote in his favor after installing 3 new justices to the court. Individual election challenges continue to be filed, but continue to be dismissed as well, with only 1 out of the almost 60 lawsuits filed having any results, and that one only dealt with how far election observers were allowed to stand over vote counters. SCOTUS refused to hear a case from Kansas concerning the legality of the state's voter registration law, which mandated a voter prove their citizenship status in order to legitimately register to vote. The High Court's refusal leaves in place appellate decisions that invalidated the law. SCOTUS also refused to hear a case concerning the Trump administration's stated goal of excluding undocumented immigrants from the official census count, saying that the case was premature as no official action was taken by the president yet. Separately, the issue is still being litigated in the federal Northern District of California, with Judge Lucy Coe ordering the government to release documents related to how they are counting the population. SCOTUS did announce that they are going to hear a case concerning whether the NCAA athletes should get compensated. As of right now, college athletes are compensated very little, if at all, for their likenesses in the media, as well as their labor in actually performing in college sporting events, unlike their professional colleagues in the major sports organizations like the NBA. 38 state attorneys general, led by New York Attorney General Letitia James, sued Google in an antitrust suit, claiming the search engine giant was manipulating results to favor its own products, stifling competition in a market that Google clearly dominates. The lawsuit was a long time coming, following the filing of a lawsuit by the Department of Justice against social media giant Facebook for antitrust reasons as well. 10 states also separately sued Google, saying the company conspired with Facebook to prohibit other companies from having their ads featured on the search engine. Republicans sued in federal court in Georgia to block absentee voting ahead of the Georgia runoffs on January 5th that can decide the control of the Senate chamber. Judge Eleanor Louise Ross dismissed the case for a lack of standing while voters stand in line for early voting in the state. The Department of Justice is announcing a settlement in a case with the United Auto Workers Union that would reform the structure of the labor organization after a corruption investigation revealed that the union's top leaders, including 2 former presidents, were mixing their official duties for personal benefit. And finally, in national news, the nation began receiving Pfizer vaccines all over this week, with medical personnel and nursing home residents receiving the first doses and debates ongoing about who should get vaccines next, with inclinations towards essential workers. States are still holding out for more money in order to support distribution of the vaccine, costing billions of dollars to do so, and certain groups in the population are going to have to individually discuss getting the vaccine with their doctors, such as children and pregnant women, who are not included in vaccine trials. Data continues to be released that shows the stark effect of the pandemic, with the poverty rate increasing to 11.7% or 8 million people, and an increase in military families, among others, seeking food assistance. Evictions are on the rise, with moratoriums expiring at the end of the year if Congress doesn't do anything. A third of U.S. households are behind on rent or mortgage payments and could face eviction or foreclosure in the next 2 months. 1 in 5 prisoners in the U.S. have COVID, with 1,700 having died from the virus. In a late development, Britain instituted new lockdowns in response to a mutated strain of the coronavirus, which increased transmissibility by 70%. Multiple countries banned UK flights in response, including Italy, Belgium, Austria, and the Netherlands. That's it for this week's show on the 25th hour, helping you beat the 24/7 news cycle every Sunday afternoon. I ask that you please rate, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends, and don't forget to become a patron today at patreon.com/the25thhournews. As always, you can email your tips and suggestions at the25thhournews@gmail.com. Follow us on most of your social media platforms and spread New York City's soon-to-be top-rated political podcast. I'm Dennis Vitorian. Have a great week.